Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. Neither too loud nor too quiet.
That's a voice of Dr. Francis Moroney. He gave a lecture here last year on the architectural history of Judson Memorial Church, and he's going to join us on our virtual site visit. It's certainly not typical times we're in right now, but luckily Judson is not a typical church, and we're going to continue that theme with our virtual open house. And we really consider it unfortunate we can't be together in person, but we hope this is a chance for you to see the landmark location from a unique perspective and maybe inspire a future visit.
Quiet. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to give this talk. For as long as I've lived in New York, which is a really, really long time, I've loved Judson Church, and the truth is that I've never had the opportunity, the occasion to give it my full attention. And this is that occasion. So what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is the architecture of Judson Memorial Church. Everyone seated here tonight knows that this is a wonderful building, a remarkable building, that it must have lots of stories behind it, knows that it was designed by Stanford White, and you know what a fascinating character Stanford White was, and so on. Yet, there is also a respect in which the architecture of Judson has been so overshadowed over the years by the rest of Judson's history. The history of Judson Memorial Church is so rich and so varied. The relationship of Judson to the art scene of Greenwich Village, the fact that this was the preeminent venue of the avant-garde in New York City in the 1960s and in other decades has, in fact, overshadowed the architecture. Case in point, if you go looking online for pictures of Judson's architecture, not that they're not there, it's just that you have to wade through so many photographs of performances that have taken place in this space and so on, that it is, well, not to be too blunt, but it's really frustrating. Anyway, but what that tells you is that Judson's history is indeed so rich and varied.
This portrait is Adeniram Judson. He was one of the first American missionaries, period. In 1813, he traveled to what was then known as Burma, now Myanmar, where he spent 12 years converting 18 souls and translating the language into English, including the New Testament. Adeniram begat Edward in Burma in 1844. This is him. And Edward eventually followed in his father's footsteps, except that by the mid-1800s, it made less sense to mission in exotic locations as folks from all over the world were pouring into Lower Manhattan, which is where he found Judson Church and named it after his father. Let's say it's normal times and you're visiting Judson for the first time. This is likely where you'll emerge here at the West 4th Street train station and next to the famous street courts. And you just take a right here on 3rd or 4th to go to Judson directly. But I'm going to suggest that you go north a few blocks to 9th or 10th Street and come down around on 5th Avenue as though you're going to march through the arch with a triumphant army and see Judson for the first time entering through the arch. And this isn't, I'm not suggesting this just for effect or exercise. Both the arch and Judson share the same architect and era of build. And more importantly, this geographic separation between the north and the south side of the park had everything to do with why Judson is where it is and what it is.
A major purpose behind Judson Church was to be a beacon of beauty in a neighborhood that at the time the church was built was considered, believe it or not, to be a blighted neighborhood. The south side of Washington Square was very different from the north side of Washington Square, and this was a neighborhood that was described this way. The Reverend Dr. George Dana Boardman said, "This monument," and by monument he meant Judson Church, and this was just as it was being constructed, "this monument will not be a useless shaft, but a massive church, perfectly adapted to Christian work. It is providential that it should be located in Lower New York, where foreign nationalities may benefit by it and be told that it was built to honor the memory of the first Americans who carried the gospel to foreign lands. The new church will be in a strategic position. It will be on the border of a dense tenement house district, and yet only a stone's throw from a most respectable and aristocratic neighborhood, from which we hope many will come to join us in our work." This was quoted in the New York Times on July 1st, 1890, and the Times itself added that Judson, the Reverend Edward Judson, who was the builder of the church, feels that no monument could be so fitting as a memorial mission church erected where, and gosh, you gotta love old newspapers, foreign and incongruous elements of the population may be most easily reached and influenced. I think by incongruous, they must have meant me. Anyway, this is from the New York Tribune of December 24th, 1891. Close behind the church in 3rd Street huddle some of the most degraded dens of pollution, and poverty-stricken pollution at that, that the big city contains. The buildings are either decayed private houses, once the home of the well-to-do, or they are now tenement houses with low rentals and the regulation sardine box capacity.
It's as though past the arch, it's the lower decks of the Titanic or gangs of New York down there. You would expect a roving gang of nativist Protestants to overrun you at any moment. I'm not trying to go all Ken Burns on your site visit, but I really am selling this idea of coming in from the north with the arch and the park as essentially a kind of grand foyer. The building doesn't really announce itself when you're coming directly or from the south. It just sort of suddenly appears as this large structure already on top of you. Kind of like that huge building you see swallowing the sky behind the church like the fever dream of a Soviet planner. The church sold that lot to NYU in the late 90s in order to take on a major restoration of the building. It was originally the church's settlement house on the rear lot. Let's hop back there real quick and just want to show you the Edgar Allan Poe house. So I'll come clean. There's not much to see except for this plaque that suggests something was nearby. And an older resident who caught me filming said that the original Edgar Allan Poe house was exactly next door to where this facade is that they evidently constructed in Minecraft and inserted into the new building here. Inside, we'll take a look at the rose window, which is on the rear of the building there, and the light was actually blocked by this new structure, and which wasn't in the original agreement. And the building built a special room with a 1,000 neon tubes in order to light the rose window from behind. We're looking at the church from Thompson Street at the corner of Thompson and West 4th. That little side entrance there is a primary entrance for the church all year long because it's the single accessible entrance due to a small lift inside, minus the host that's not usually there. And we'll go in and I'll give you my elevator pitch, quite literally. The pandemic aside, it's kind of a good time for this because Judson has been shrouded in scaffolding for the last 2 years as they were putting on a red clay tile roof slated to last 100 years. It was the second major project of a multi-phase capital campaign that was to culminate this year with the heaviest lift, no pun intended, by raising funds to replace this lift with a proper elevator so those needing it for access wouldn't feel like they're entering a treacherous salt mine. It's safe to say the pandemic has put a sort of blurry halt to several years of momentum as the church works to thread the virtual needle here and elsewhere with public safety in mind.
So there it is.
You'll notice a complete lack of pews, which is how Judson's rolled since the 60s when they took them out to make space for innovative dance and burgeoning off-Broadway projects.
Here you see the windows as they relate to the overall interior, including the wooden beamed ceiling.
The light blue color scheme is something they researched during the renovation in 99, 2000, and that it was original to when the church was first built. And we'll light the rose window for you here. That's the south-facing window with the neon tubes. Come on, tubes. Nice. The room also has basic theatrical light for events and stuff, so there's a little extra artificial light to go around when you need it.
My goodness gracious. Now, if you look at the Washington Arch, you see the rosette pattern on the underside of the arch that White designed, and he repeats that in the underside of the arch of the entrance. The same exact rosette pattern looks to be almost possibly the same mold that was used. And that mold comes into the interior of the church as well. The arches of the windows echo the arches of the outside of the building, and there's this wonderful feeling of interpenetration between the outside and the inside. And this carries over to the windows that Lafarge designed. Now, you'll often read that Lafarge's windows were designed over a period of years following the opening of the church, but the truth is that most of Lafarge's windows were done right after the church opened. Most of them were done between 1892 and 1896. Throughout that period, McKim, Mead, and White were still very heavily involved in the church and finishing off this and that. So it truly was a collaboration. And Lafarge, in the windows, particularly the ones that are right behind you, everybody turn around, just crane your necks, and look at the windows, those three windows which show St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. John the Evangelist, are wonderful windows. Look at how the architecture is echoed. You can look at the screen now. Look at how the architecture is echoed in these windows, particularly in this St. Paul window, the way that St. Paul's halo sort of dissolves into the architectural frame of the stained glass image, and how that architectural frame echoes elements from throughout the church. It's wonderful because the windows simply aren't placed in the church. They become truly an integral part of the architectural design of the church. And that's something that you don't find that often. It was very carefully done. You gotta believe that Lafarge and White consulted with each other about this.
This angel relief behind the altar was often attributed to Augustus St. Gaudens, but a congregant looked it up in the catalog and it says wrongly attributed. It's thought to be Herbert Adams, potentially based on a sketch by Augustus St. Gaudens.
Here we see the Terra Cotta. There's Terra Cotta throughout the building, but to me, the most remarkable use of it in the building is in that base that, again, it looks like rusticated stonework with what we call continuous channeling. It's very beautiful, wonderfully done, but it's terra cotta produced by the Perth Amboy Terra Cotta Company, which is the company that McKim, Mead, and White always worked with when they used terra cotta. And you see the Roman brick. You see the terra cotta in relation to the Roman brick, the terra cotta base, and that wonderful golden, as we call it, iron-spotted brick above that catches the light so beautifully. At the right time of day, this building just gleams, as all buildings made of that kind of brick do in New York. White was one of those architects, by the way, keenly aware of the special light of New York City. He knew the skies of New York to be Roman skies, as indeed they are, since you may not know it, but New York is at the same latitude as Rome.
During regular operation, Judson is a never-ending open house. Things are mostly free, and no one minds if someone just wants to step in to see the windows. And in the same way that the Lafarge designs work in concert with the architecture, they're also not fully present until something's in the space and the figures are looking down from the windows as kind of uncensoring spectators. And, you know, any empty theater or church or purpose-built structure has an architectural interest when it's empty. But I think what is unique about Judson is how often what is going on there is confronting or collaborating with the architecture as opposed to just being housed by it. And it makes you think that the civilizing force, the residents of the North Side pictured, has been anything but. It's still the lower decks of the Titanic and first class and the engine room.
Now, this is truly the only picture I could find of the Reverend Edward Judson. I should have asked the archivist here for a picture. I'm sure you have tons of them, right? 3. Okay. Are they any better than this? Okay. Yeah. Well, this is the only one online. Will you put yours up online? Oh, thank you. Pleasant-looking fella. But I just want to conclude by reading a paragraph from something that he wrote, an article that he wrote. I think it's very fitting, and I read this because I'm very strongly of the opinion that architecture and art are not they're part of the mission of a church. You'll very often find, and I don't mean to say this in any sneering sort of way, but too often in my experience as an architectural historian with a great interest in churches, pastors of churches, administrators of churches, see architecture as something that gets in the way. They see it as a problem. They see it as a question of upkeep. They live in fear their church is going to be designated as a landmark, which means they're not going to be able to tear it down and replace it with a high-rise building with a new church in the base, and stuff like that. Then there are others who say, architecture is a frill, that, churches are about spirituality, they are about, to the extent that they are about things material, they are about feeding the poor. And, once people start talking about feeding the poor, it becomes, you kind of like, you lost the argument. But there is a sense in which, I think a very real sense in which the beauty of a church is an extremely important thing in the lives of the congregants of that church and of people who are not congregants of that church, but who can nonetheless be affected by that church. And that's something that the Reverend Judson understood. He understood it. And we know he understood it because he wrote this essay called The Church and Its Social Aspect, which appeared in that very popular journal called The Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, July-December 1907 issue. And here is what the Reverend Judson said. The masses in New York require our very best preaching, architecture, and music. It's a mistake to try to reach them with cheap and nasty appliances. If I had my way, I would put the most beautiful churches among the homes of the poor, so that it would be only a step from the squalor of the tenement house into a new and contrasted world. The rich have beautiful objects in their homes. They should be content with plainness in church. But when we bring together the poor and the sad, let their eyes, grown dim with tears and weariness, find repose and inspiration in the exquisite arch and the opalescent window through which shimmer the suggestive figures of saints and martyrs. Let their ears hear only the sweetest and most ennobling music. Let everything in church be educational and uplifting. The poor used to be taught to be patient under their sufferings, in hope of a blissful hereafter. But now they are waking up to the fact that the rich, in their refinement of selfishness, propose to get the better of them in both worlds. Not only to monopolize the good things of this life, but also to appropriate the things that are supposed to help people heavenward as the best preaching and music and architecture. And to that, one can only say, Amen.